This afternoon, I am in Boston talking with Elizabeth M. McKenzie, who is professor of law and now, since 2013, the retired librarian at Suffolk University Law School. Betsy, you came to Suffolk in 1996. I'm dating both of us a little more than I want. I apologize for that. So it was 1996 for the record. It is our custom, Betsy, to begin these conversations by asking you sort of more about yourself as a real person, not just a colleague. Not that they're any different, but could I ask you a little bit about your life, not only perhaps today, but when you were younger?
I grew up in Lexington, Kentucky. I was one of 5 children there. My sister and I are both lawyers. We were the black sheep of the family.
The black sheep of the family. Well, we won't tell the family that.
My father wanted all of us to be doctors, and I don't think he ever quite got over the idea that lawyers are all about malpractice, even though neither my sister...
So he was a physician?
Yes.
Oh, yes, I understand the concerns.
Yeah, he couldn't get that out of his head, so neither one of us ever did malpractice, but it was just one of those 2 bad things. So I got married in 1978, just before I started law school at the University of Kentucky. Let's see, I practiced for a couple years as a Reginald Heber Smith Community Law Fellow.
Oh, yes.
And people have to be...
It was a biggie in the American Bar Association, as I recall.
It was, but you have to be a fairly experienced or person to know anything about Reggies by now. But I was very honored to be a Reggie, and I enjoyed it. I was a Reggie at the Central Kentucky Legal Services in Lexington. And when I finished my 2nd year as a Reggie, which was an option, I talked to my husband about should we move so I could go on working for legal services, because I had an option to work in either Ashland, Kentucky or Louisville, Kentucky. He said, could we go on living in Lexington? And that's when I stopped being a lawyer and actually went back to school to finish working on a library degree. I had started that degree when I was in law school because Bill James at the University of Kentucky had talked to me about being a law librarian, he and his staff, when I was a law student. And I had a law librarianship class with him. And he really encouraged me. He was really my first mentor.
Well, Bill encouraged other colleagues, and I've heard in some of these stories, Rhea Ballard Thrower, who's actually was the law librarian at Howard for a long time and is now the university librarian there just this year.
I heard that.
Yeah. She was one, and her response to Bill James, she said in her interview, it's in the thing, is when he said you should become a law librarian, she looked at him as only Rhea could and said, "What's that?"
She has a funnier story than I do every darn time. She's a funny person.
Oh, she's a wonderful colleague. Yeah, you're right. She's got some pretty good stories.
Yeah. I think my only good story about Bill James was the time that only time I took a can of Coca-Cola into the library, and that was the time that Bill James walked by and
then you got caught. Oh, that's very bad.
Oh, he gave me a look. He just looked at me, and he shook his head in disappointment, and it was far worse than being yelled at.
He had the right technique. I bet you never brought another bottle of Coke or anything else in there that wasn't permitted.
Oh, I felt about 2 inches high. It was terrible. I tried this on students and it didn't work at all.
Maybe Bill had some other technique and mastered it.
I think you had to care what somebody thinks about you for it to work.
You're right, some of the students, I suppose, would not.
No. So, anyway, Bill was very good. And I always enjoyed seeing him at the meetings. It was always a pleasure. So, I'm not sure what Bill's doing right now, but I hope he's enjoying retirement.
Yeah, well, I hope I can track him down sometime. I'd love to chat with him for our history, and I'll be working on it at some point.
Well, if
trying
you
to
find
him.
out, if you find out where he is, let me know.
Well, unfortunately, people who retire sometimes drop off the whole grid, and tracking them down is one of my biggest undertakings when I set up one of these trips to go and do some of these conversations for the oral history. Is finding people where they are.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, before we sort of begin back into your career, that is after legal services work and getting your final degree, the library degree, could I ask you if you have any hobbies or other special passions today that you occupy time with? Well, you're a tenured professor, either in or out of off the clock.
I probably should mention I do have 2 children. They're
Yeah.
grown up. They're not little enough to
The
need me.
civilized variety now, huh?
So I don't need to do anything for them, but they are part of my life and a pleasure. No grandchildren. I like learning more about native plants and how they support wildlife. So I like learning more about ecosystems. And this is an interesting place to learn it, so that's been fun. And I like kayaking.
Kayaking?
Yeah. Not whitewater kayaking.
No,
No.
you like the smooth kind?
Yeah, I live near a very beautiful river, the Neponset River,
Uh-huh.
and I kayak on there, and it's been a lot of fun.
Oh, that sounds
Yeah.
like an interesting little passion to have, especially here in Boston where you have water everywhere around.
There's a lot of water up
Yeah.
here, and
Some of it's probably a tad rough for kayakers. I'm thinking you get out on the ocean area.
yeah, I don't do ocean kayaking.
Yeah. Well, sort of getting back to you sort of as a career, I assume Bill James had some role in convincing you that perhaps law librarianship was a career that you might want to consider, or was there
Yeah.
anybody else or somebody else that did that?
Well, it was Bill James because, I mean, for most people, this is a hidden career. How would you know there was such a thing as being a law librarian? And it was probably one of the luckiest little discoveries of my life. Because I have to say, I enjoyed being a lawyer, but I think I've been a much happier person being a law librarian for almost all of my career. It's been probably the luckiest left turn I ever made. So I'm very grateful to Bill James and the staff members at that library who helped me figure out that that was a thing I could do with a law degree besides just being a lawyer.
Good. Now, when you went to library school, or at least began, were you still at legal services, or?
No, I waited till I finished that 2-year, well, I had some law library school classes the summer between 1L and 2L. Then I didn't do any more classes until I came back after I finished at Central Kentucky Legal Services as a Reggie Fellow. So I finished in 1 more year after that.
Well, when you graduated from library school, the notes I saw and trying to prepare for today's conversations said that you took a position as the information specialist for the Kentucky Department of Natural Resources and Environmental Protection, which was in Frankfort.
Yes.
I hope all my notes were correct.
They are.
Good.
That actually, I got to start that before I finished my degree, which was a very lucky thing for me. It gave me a chance to get real library experience before I graduated, which over and over, I think every librarian sees. Libraries want to hire people with real library experience, not just student or intern experience. And it's one of the ludicrous things that we do. Why do we expect to be able to hire people from library school who have real experience, and there's only very few people who can do that. But I was one of the lucky few who did that, and it was very fortunate for me, because then I was able to go from that, because I had managed another student while I was doing that, and managed this library, which was a very tiny library, but it was its own freestanding library. That then I was able to be hired from there directly to a management position at St. Louis U.
Yeah. Now, I noticed you moved over to the university in 1986 and became the Reader Services Librarian at St. Louis University Law Library. Now you're head librarian, as I think they were called, or something other than directors or associate deans in those days, was Eileen Searles, was it not?
Yep.
Yeah, she was a heavyweight in our field.
Yes,
I
she
remember.
was.
Yeah.
She
Delightful
was.
lady too, at least to me.
Yes, and I enjoyed working for her. She was one of those people who, instead of just saying, you know, I think that we need to have emergency lights on the second floor of the library. This is a real story. She sat there and told the contractor this long story about how if the lights went out, there would be people struggling to find the doors and piling up in the stairways and dying in dozens because they didn't have emergency lights. And this man sat there and listened to this terrible story that was all hypothetical. And she was just describing to her her feelings about how important
chaos is
yes,
setting in.
Yes, and how important those lights would be. And I think hoping that he would give her a good price because the lights would be so vital.
If she was really...
And after she finished the story and he said, I see. I said, do you understand that she's asking you for a bid on these lights, for the emergency lights? He said, oh!
I was surprised she didn't hold him up to, he'd pay for them, or his company.
She could make a penny scream. She was very, very thrifty.
All right,
and
frugal.
Frugal, yes, and positive virtue in a law librarian, any librarian.
Absolutely.
But she did tell stories about in the early years of being a librarian and going down to the conferences on their own dime and having no money at all.
Well, a lot of our colleagues of the earlier era, that was pretty common.
Well, and I think it's still common for firm librarians and some court librarians, and now it's going to be common for a lot of university librarians again, because the travel budgets are being slashed.
Yeah.
And so she told me about making a whole purse full, and I mean, she had a purse like a travel bag full of hard-boiled eggs, so that she and all her staff who went would have something to eat.
They wouldn't starve.
Oh, yeah, but they must have been hardly sick of hard-boiled eggs before they came back.
Maybe so, but at
yes.
least they were well fed.
They didn't starve. They didn't starve. So anytime I would talk about, things being tight or maybe being a little tough to manage, she would have a story that would certainly top anything I had.
Well, you've sort of already explained that Bill James had a hand in helping you to become acquainted with our niche of the legal profession, law librarianship. Perhaps he also was a mentor, or maybe others, Eileen or other colleagues. Did any of them serve in a way that you consider them mentors? Absolutely.
Eileen certainly was another mentor. She worked hard to try to make sure that everybody who worked for her would be mentored and introduced around. If she got you to a conference, she introduced you to people. She told you to bring your business cards. She if she found people from her staff sitting together at an event, she would separate you and make you sit with perfect strangers.
You need to network, huh?
So it was tough love,
Mhm.
but it was actually very good. I learned to put my little hand out, shake hands, and introduce myself to perfect strangers, and because of that, I met an awful lot of new friends from all around the world.
Yeah.
And
That
it was
was
good.
pretty much the norm. Maybe all these old directors got the idea from each other, but my first meeting, my new boss, Al Coco from Houston, he took me, I think I met everyone under the sun, especially a lot of the important so-called leaders of the time. And I was impressed. One, he knew them, and two, he introduced me to them. It was really nice.
Yeah, it was. I felt very honored. And Eileen would make sure that I got to various meetings at the school. She would explain things to people, not just me, but other people on the staff too, like Jim Nellis or Richard Amelung or another. She would make us trade jobs so that we cross-trained.
Oh, so you'd understand if somebody was out that day and a need came, she had it all covered with this talent.
Well, relatively speaking, I was not a very good cataloger.
Well, maybe
But at least-
cataloging could wait for a day or two.
At least I understood the theory of it and understood how hard it was and the importance of it.
No, probably helped you when you needed to use the resources on reference questions and so
Yeah,
on.
it did.
To know sort of what it was all about.
I did,
Yeah.
I did.
Good.
And other mentors on the staff, actually, Carol Moody. This is,
Mhm.
do you know Carol Moody?
Oh, yes.
Oh, great, oh, great. She was, I learned a lot from her because she was a fabulous reference person and a great resource. And so I learned a lot just working with her. I learned a lot working with Jim.
Mhm.
He was already there, so he had more experience than me, although I think he's younger than I am.
Well, age has nothing to do with that kind of experience.
No, he was a great colleague
Yeah.
and a good friend.
Well, field was full of people like that.
Yeah,
And,
and
it's been
Richard.
wonderful to reconnect with some of you now, late in my years,
Yeah.
going around doing these conversations for the oral history. It's fascinating.
You know, one of the things Eileen did that was very cool was every AALL that she went to, she would host a party
Uh-huh.
and invite not just all her current staff, but everybody she could find who was attending, who had ever worked for her.
Mm.
And so you would meet people like Cosette's son,
Mhm.
or anybody who ever worked for Eileen. And it meant that you also got to reconnect after you stopped working for her
Mhm.
with former colleagues. So that was a nice thing too.
Mm.
Plus you got to see Eileen again.
It sounds like a nice place to work in that era.
It was,
Yeah.
it was a real
Yeah.
neat place.
And you were there around 10 years.
I was.
Before you moved back up here to Boston and Suffolk, where you are,
Yeah,
as the director of the law library and an associate professor of law at that time. And that was 1996, according to the notes I saw.
yeah, let me just jump back to being at St.
Oh.
Louis U. One of the reasons I was there as long as I was, I had intended originally to be there about 5 or 6 years. I ended up serving on the faculty senate because there librarians were allowed to serve,
Mhm.
and I was elected as president of the faculty senate,
Oh.
which entailed serving a year as the president-elect, vice president,
Uh,
and then 2 years as the president, and then another year as the,
That's pretty substantial commitment for
Yeah.
faculty, the 4-year commitment.
it was,
Yeah.
it was. So I
That must have been a very interesting experience. I mean, learning and seeing issues on a much broader scope than in the law library or the law school only.
It really was. It
Yeah.
really was. It was a school that had a medical school
Mhm.
in addition to a large undergraduate College of Arts and Sciences with lots of different departments, and then the law school. And one of the things that startled me, because I had been so steeped in the law school, was finding out that colleagues in the sciences, mathematics, and the medical school really didn't think that much of the scholarship in the law school, because scholarship in the law school is published by our students. They're huge, big pieces written by a single person, where the scholarship in these other departments is peer-reviewed.
Yeah.
They're short to the point. They're based on empirical research. They may be written and co-authored by 20 people,
Yeah.
but it's, it's based on empirical research and peer-reviewed.
Yeah.
And
It's a whole different kind of a discipline, though, the others
It is.
from ours.
It was very eye-opening to
Yeah.
find out that there could be such different views, and that people could be denigrating of something that, I had just sort of had my blinders on.
Now, did the Senate or some unit of the Senate have oversight on tenure decisions in the
Yes.
law school?
Yes.
We fought that battle fought them off for years with the American Bar Association rules on independence and not having other disciplines have too much say on what we did.
Well, it usually ended up being a rubber stamp,
Yeah.
and there was a very powerful law school presence in the Senate.
Okay.
But it was important to educate people
Mm-hmm.
about there are different kinds of scholarship.
Yeah.
And just as you would never think to criticize the art faculty because their scholarship is writing a play or painting or, dance or something like that, you can't compare apples and oranges. It's very different.
Same thing with the appropriate terminal degree in each discipline. Some people would come from faculties where if you did not have a PhD, you were, not faculty qualified.
True.
But in law school, usually the first professional degree, the JD, medical, the MD, was quite, that would be the appropriate degree. And in other disciplines, it wouldn't necessarily be a doctoral degree.
Yeah.
But that, I noticed from my experience, was a little more readily accepted than perhaps this question of how peer-reviewed was that thing you wrote.
It's very interesting how snobbishness can work.
Oh.
Yeah. We're having the same conversations now that we have a faculty senate here.
Oh.
We just recently got one. No sooner do you have a faculty senate than the argument crops up, I guess.
Yeah. Well, we had the faculty senate where I was at American, but the law school kept as independent of it as possible and got away with it for at least the whole time I was there. Also, it was not seen by the faculty in the law school as something that was a desirable activity in the sense that they didn't want to do it. So guess who was on the Senate for a very long time? Me. And I enjoyed it immensely. I loved meeting the people elsewhere and working with them and fending off the attacks on our budgets that came periodically.
Well, it can
group.
be an enormously important and powerful governance tool.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we have found that here.
Yeah. Well, it acts with, when it's a proper Senate, totally independent of, say, the central administration, and they are dependent on the Senate's approval of certain kinds of actions, it gives the faculty a real position of power. And that's crucial and often in higher education.
We only just got this one here, and we're so grateful for it.
Oh, that's interesting. I just sort of assumed that most colleges and universities had some sort of a Senate, but you're probably right. Maybe they're not that common.
Oh, I think they are, but Suffolk is very late to the game with it.
Uh-huh. Well, you've got one now. Can we talk a little bit about your time here at Suffolk? You came as director of the library, or
Right.
whatever the title of the era was,
That was the
associate
title.
dean for whatever.
I was never called that. I was always called director of the
Yeah,
library.
that was always my title too, but
Yeah.
my successor was appointed associate dean with whatever.
The titles keep morphing around,
Yeah.
and sometimes it reflects a real change in what they do.
Mhm.
Like, I think these changes recently have reflected that.
Yeah, the taking on roles outside of the traditional library, such as for the technology and so on, is a game changer.
Yeah.
It's appropriate to see that in the title, I think.
I never oversaw the technology here.
Mm-hmm.
There was consideration of it at different points, but I never did that. I always just did the
Yeah.
library.
Well, I came in as a law librarian, which was the normal title when I started in the early 70s.
That's what Eileen called herself.
And I had a dean who came in 10 years or so later who said, everybody else is now a director, Pat, you are too. So that was how that happened. I didn't ask. I don't know if I could have said no even. Tom had it all figured out, so that's how it came, yeah. Now, so you have been here since the mid-90s, and you're now no longer active in the library as such. You're sort of in a phase of your life where you're just a full-time faculty member, or?
Well, actually, let's see, starting this past July, I'm in what they call phased retirement.
Okay.
Which means this year I'm only teaching the fall semester.
Uh-huh.
But I'm teaching a full load this semester.
Mhm.
Next year I'll be teaching in the fall semester, but teaching a half load. And the year after that I'll do the same, and then I'll be done.
Good. Does that mean in the spring you're free as a bird and do anything you want?
I am.
You can practice retirement then.
I am looking at that, and that's one of the things I'm busy studying what you're doing and going, hey, that sounds pretty awesome. Just travel around, buy a car, and just go.
Yeah.
That's-
I think my kids are a little nervous about some of my expenses because, I'm basically out spending their potential inheritances on toys for Dad.
You need one of those bumper stickers that says, yes,
I've seen those. I don't want to throw that in their faces. Actually, they're good people. But and Robert, my son, with whom I live, actually, he and his wife live in my home. Which is good for both of us, especially for me, because one of these days I may be on the floor incapacitated, and hopefully somebody will discover me. That way. I hope it doesn't happen that way, but it plays out. But he would never say anything there, but I'm sure he's thinking that I bought a car for these trips and things like that. Maybe Dad could, at least if he's to buy a car, get a little more modest to type.
well, at least you didn't get a red sports car that's convertible.
Well, that's true. No, I didn't. I was afraid every policeman on the road would be stopping me to see how fast I was going. Maybe checking the GPS or whatever they could check to see if I was caught speeding when he wasn't watching. But you're right about that. Well, so you've had an interesting time here. Now you're sort of in phasing down stage. That retirement's nice. Every morning you get up is Saturday somehow.
It sounds very nice.
Yeah.
It does.
But you have actually been busy, in addition to your day jobs of various sorts. You've got a long list of articles that you've written over the years, and including an interesting one, a chapter in a book, and even your own blog these days, which, never having had a blog, I'm very overawed by them. They may not be what I think they are, but you call yours Out of the Jungle.
Well, that was actually originally Jim Millis's blog.
Uh-huh.
And I promised from, I think, the beginning or nearly the beginning that I would co-blog with him. And when he stopped being in libraries, he stepped out of the blog.
Uh-huh.
And I think it's still officially his blog. But to tell you the truth, I have pretty much stopped blogging on it since I haven't been in libraries. I put a few things on since I stopped in libraries in 2013, but I've almost stopped blogging there. I have another couple blogs. I have one that's poetry and another one that's letterboxes. But I'm not a real active blogger now. I blogged for almost 20 years.
Wow. Well, I guess most bloggers are sort of a labor of love, so they can control how much love they want to get out of it or put into it, I suppose.
I enjoyed it very much. I did. It started out as an argument between Jim and me about paper versus online as a future for books.
Mm-hmm.
And it was an exaggerated argument because, of course, you can't say that everything has to remain in paper.
No.
And Jim, I don't think, really meant that paper was completely over. But it was an argument that was designed to be an eye catcher
Sort
on
of
the
a
blog.
provocative thing.
Yeah, but I'm
trigger comments perhaps in return.
Yes, and a lot of eyeballs. But I'm afraid it branded me as being a Luddite, which I am not, never have been. But it...
Well, you have another item which perhaps was controversial at the time. In fact, it's you wrote an article called "Leaving Paradise," dropping out of the Federal Depository Library Program, and this was sort of back before a lot of people really gave that a little more serious thought. This is back around 1999. I noticed it was given the Law Library Journal Article of the Year Award that year.
I don't know, that's not the one that got the Article of the Year award.
Oh, my notes are wrong. Well, do correct the record, please.
It was ironic to write that story, that article, the one about leaving Paradise, leaving the Federal Depository System, because that was the year that I was the chair of the SIS that year that would have been interested in that. And yet the reason we dropped out was we were moving from a small library in a neighborhood on the backside of Beacon Hill over to this new location where we're sitting in the building now today, that's right at the corner of the Boston Common. And it's a much higher profile building. And one of the things we talked about was if we were still a federal depository and somebody came and said at the entrance of the building that they wanted to do research in the depository, we would have to let them in, no matter what we thought their real use of the building really was going to be.
Or in this day and age, what their real interest in getting inside was, let alone whether there's going to be use at all.
Yes, and we felt it might be more suspicious. So we talked it over and said we might be wiser to drop out of the depository entirely. And we are a short trolley ride or a long walk from the regional depository library, which is at the Boston Public Library.
Yeah, well,
I can walk there from here.
Why not go there, I guess, given the trade-offs you were talking about?
And it was easy to leave because we had a good relationship with the depository, the regional depository. We had always done our best to really be open to the public and follow the rules. Well, plus we were ahead of the rush to leave.
Well, there have been, I understand, quite a few that have rethought this in light of the cost of housing things in paper as well as the access requirements.
Yeah, it's less and less of a benefit to a library and less important to their patrons too. So it's the depository library system. If you lived in West Podunk in the middle of a rural area and you were a depository library there, it might be very important to remain in the system, but not here.
Well, you also wouldn't have the risks of hordes of people showing up at the door someday, and I mean, just the numbers would be sort of more manageable.
It would be less risk and more benefit.
Yeah.
True. But the article you were thinking about that won the award was an article I co-authored with a colleague and friend at St. Louis U about accessibility in libraries for blind and visually disabled.
Hmm.
And at the time, it was news and cutting-edge information for law libraries. It was all about the sorts of technology, like screen readers.
Yeah.
That
That was
was
sort of
available.
the earlier stages of the aftermath of the Americans with Disabilities Act being passed by Congress, and all the things we were learning that we needed to be doing that we hadn't known before.
Well, it was partly about that and partly because my friend had I think it was a relative, maybe it was a friend, maybe it was both, who was blind.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was why she was listed as a co-author, was she was the one who knew all these various technologies and could talk about what really worked and what was useful, and could point me to the various resources, and then I could do the research on them and write about them.
Well, that's interesting. Now, I know in addition to this article and some of your blogging and some of the other things, you've also been of service to the profession in a whole other set of ways. You've been, you're past chair of the Reader Services Special Interest section of ALL, chair of the Legal Information Services to the Public Special Interest section. That must be the one where you did the earlier work you were talking about.
Yes, LISP.
The list, yeah. You're a past president of the New England Law Library Consortium, and past president of the Association of Boston Law Libraries. And I even noticed that I think you're still on the board of the Law Library Microform Consortium, or is that term over now?
That term is over.
Okay.
That term is over. But yeah, I've done a lot of different things, and it has been a pleasure.
Yeah.
It really has. I was also on the NELCO board up
Okay.
here, and that was another distinct pleasure.
Have you been involved in any other professional associations?
I've always been a member of the ABA and the Kentucky Bar, and whatever was the regional group for AALL. I've been a member of AALL, and then when I was in St. Louis, it was MALL.
Yeah.
Now
So
that
the
I'm up
local
here.
chapter and
Yeah,
local
so
city group,
LLNE
if they
up
have
here.
one too.
And then, yes, ABLE, which is not affiliated with AALL, interestingly enough. ABLE is distinctively different and independent. Association of Boston Law Libraries. But it's, I was actually the president of ABLE too. It's largely focused on the local firm librarians, but there are academic members. And I was so glad that I got involved in that, because I did get to know a number of the firm librarians locally. And I have contacts in the firms where I think a lot of the academics don't. And a few of the academics, like Philippa, have worked in firms.
Yeah.
But not all, and not a lot of the newer ones. And I've never worked in a firm. I've always been an academic. So I'm just so pleased that I had that contact and did that work. So I got to know people in the courts, and I got to know people in the firms that I wouldn't have known otherwise. This is just such a nice city to be a law librarian in. Between LLNE and ABLE and NELCO, you have such a nice community of law librarians. It's very welcoming.
Well, maybe on that note, I should sort of suggest maybe we're getting near the end of today's conversation. But before we do, I'd like to ask if there's anything not talked about that you would like to bring up.
I have to give a shout out to both my predecessor, Mike Slinger, who was here right before me, and gave me helpful hints and tips as I moved up here, not least of which was a warning about the cost of living in Boston. He was from the Midwest like me.
This was before you arrived?
Before I arrived.
Mhm.
Very helpful. And Ed Bander, who was such a
wonderful
doll.
man.
He
Yeah.
was such a doll. And he just was extremely great to have known. He was very generous in terms of if I ever had questions or wanted to know why something was the way it was, or needed to know anything about the history of the library, or just wanted to talk. But he was very careful not to interfere or, try to tell me what he thought I should do.
He had his watch, and now it was yours.
Well, it's not necessarily an easy thing to do.
No, I understand that.
And I have certainly tried to make a point of keeping my mouth shut as I have moved out of the library to be down
Well, I
here.
made sure I didn't have much opportunity. I moved 3,000 miles away from where I worked. when I
That's
retired.
easier. That's easier.
Billy
I'm
Joe can do whatever
5
she wants,
floors
and I don't have
down.
any idea. Yeah.
But I have tried very hard not to interfere.
Did you ever see yourself in Ed's book, The History of the Essex Law, the Unauthorized History, or something like that?
No, I don't
That
think
was
I'm
a
in
fun
there.
read, though.
I think he was looking back in time.
Yeah.
Some of those stories I definitely recognized what he was talking about.
Yeah, or who?
Yes,
Yeah.
because some of those are famous Suffolk apocrypha.
Ah, very good. Well, maybe with all that said, I should thank you, Betsy McKenzie, for taking your time and efforts to entertain me for a while this afternoon here before the camera and talking about yourself and some of what, a lot of what you've done in our profession and continue to do as you begin the phase into retirement. Sounds like you have a fascinating time ahead, as well as having already lived one. So I want to thank you on my behalf for this, and also I'm thanking you on behalf of Michelle Wu, Frank Hodak, and Dick Spinelli, with whom I have the pleasure and honor of working to put together this oral history of law librarianship for the Hein Online service. Thank you.
Well, I'm pleased to be asked. Thank you.